None of us were ready for my sister's funeral. Casey was the least prepared of us all, and it was her funeral. She cried the whole time, and I couldn't blame her. My parents fought tears and struggled to keep their composure. Everyone else at the service mourned with us while ensuring we wouldn't intervene. Our small town was a very close-knit community. People were reliant on each other and held strong beliefs. With that came tradition. There was one in particular that everyone dreaded, but knew was necessary. When we became old enough, the adults told me and Casey about the town's annual tradition. To ensure healthy crops for the next few seasons, our town would offer up an individual as a gift to the gods. This individual had to be a child because youth and purity were seen as higher value to the gods. The whole town was made to observe the ceremony and ritual. As we got older, we realized just how painful it was for everyone involved. We watched many of the families we knew bury their own children for the sake of the town. Then the day came when the fates chose Casey. She was 16 at the time and knew exactly what the ritual entailed. My family was in agony during the days leading up to the ceremony. I wasn't sure if anyone got any rest the night before. That morning, the gloominess was overwhelming. On the walk over to my town cemetery, we could feel everyone else watching us, especially my sister. At the funeral, they separated us. We each gave her one last hug, bawling and hyperventilating. I didn't want to let Casey go. I didn't want them to take her from us. But eventually, we had to be pulled away. That wasn't uncommon. Our neighbors held us back as the elders guided her into her casket. They thanked Casey for her bravery, sacrifice, and dedication to the town. My mom turned away when they sealed her in. They had to put locks on the casket to make sure she wouldn't try to escape. After that was done, the town leaders took turns saying things about Casey. They commented on how her beauty and warmth would be welcomed by the gods. But we knew how little they truly knew of her. Behind closed doors, she was feisty, fiery even. She asked lots of questions about why things were the way they were. Their voices grew louder when Casey began screaming from within the coffin. That part was always the hardest. It was when panic set in and families were forced to listen to their loved ones suffering. My mom held her face buried in my dad's chest. Our neighbors got closer to hug my folks and reassure them. I had a feeling they were also trying to be ready in case they needed to grab my father. After the leaders said what they needed to, they had men lift the coffin. Slowly, we walked to the burial site. Tombstones and ornaments adorned the cemetery. All of them tributed the gods in some way. Before long, we made it and watched as they lowered the casket into the ground. They lowered my sister into the ground. Casey's muffled screams from within the coffin could still be heard. At that point, I felt numb to it all. I had already accepted that my sister was gone. We watched on as they shoveled dirt into the ditch. We watched as they buried her alive. All of this for the gods. My fists clenched as I wished it was someone else. I wished it had been me. She only had a few years left in the ceremonial pool. After that ceremony, I was no longer eligible. That numbness stuck with me after the funeral. I think my parents felt it too, or something like it. It took them over a week to get back into something of a routine. Luckily, the townsfolk were understanding when it came to these issues. I tried to put everything I felt about my sister behind me, burying it as deep as I could. But there were times I swore I could still hear her voice or her laugh. Those moments threatened to break the dam of emotions built up within me and trigger everything I felt at my sister's funeral. The service was lovely. My brother's family really did everything they could to honor his memory. But something about his funeral was off. Grief was one thing, but this was something else entirely. It triggered something in me, and I don't even know how I can begin to understand it. My therapist sat on the opposite side of the table, jotting something down on her notepad. I had been seeing her semi-regularly since I lived a stressful life. The loss of my brother, Tom, added to that. When I told her, she was ready to delve into everything with me, helping me cope with all the grief. "Tell me more about the funeral." I looked down and racked my brain for the details. I think it started when we were saying our final goodbyes to my brother, before we went to the cemetery. It was late, so I was one of the last ones to go. I thought about how much I'd missed talking to him. It hit me that I never hear his voice again or see him once they put him in the ground. I put my hand over his as I cried. It was cold. Honestly, that was how I felt all over and inside, just cold and numb. That must have been really difficult to feel at that moment. It was a lot. What happened next? But then when I pulled my hand away, I could have sworn I saw him standing on the other side of the casket looking at me. I got startled and nearly fell back. Not long after that, we continued and got everything over to the cemetery. Let's back up for a minute. You said you saw him looking at you? From inside the casket? I thought I saw that, but I can't be sure now. It was a very emotional day. Sometimes powerful emotions make us see what we want to. You think I wanted to see my brother like that? You said you were thinking about how you'd never see him again, so your brain gave you another image of him. Maybe. Honestly, the whole thing reminded me of something. What's that, Gabriel? I continued avoiding her gaze. It'll probably sound stupid to someone like you or anyone outside the family, but there's always been this legend or myth. I don't really know what to call it, but it's something that affected my family for generations. I looked up briefly to see that she was watching me with a thoughtful expression. According to my family, there was a curse or something that was passed down to the men. Supposedly, it only affected the oldest Brentwood man in the family. It didn't occur to me until then that with my brother passing, I'm the oldest Brentwood man in the family now, at least by blood. My eyes shifted back up to my therapist, whose expression remained unchanged. Now that I think about it, maybe it isn't really a curse, as it is some kind of mental health issue. I mean, I saw my own brother standing at his funeral. That's just crazy. Careful, Gabriel. Her words barely fazed me as my mind continued to race down those tracks. Then there's the fact that it's hereditary. I mean, that just makes it seem like there's something inherently wrong with my family. Now that I'm next in line, I have to be aware of that and take care of myself. What if it's schizophrenia and I'm just hallucinating all these dead people? Remember what we said about self-diagnosing? I sighed. She was right about that. And what did you mean by seeing all these dead people? Well, there was my brother. Then there were others. I thought I saw other people in the funeral home and even at the cemetery, but when I looked again, they were gone. Some were people I even knew had died already, so it was jarring. I kept my composure as best as I could because I didn't want to ruin my brother's funeral. So, you're saying you experienced an episode during your brother's funeral where you had multiple hallucinations? I think so. Why do you think you began experiencing these hallucinations then? At your brother's funeral? Honestly, I have no idea. The timing of it is strange because it coincides with the whole curse thing. I guess the grief and stress of everything could have triggered this. Do you believe you're cursed? I looked back up at my therapist. I don't know. Well, we're out of time. We can go even deeper into this on Friday. I simply nodded as I gathered myself. A chill came over me as I got to the door. My eyes widened when I looked back at my therapist. A man in a suit stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. That man was her late husband. I knew because she kept a picture of him on her desk. My voice got caught in my throat and I decided to leave. We would have more time to discuss on Friday, especially when it came to grief, mental health, and ghosts. I think I was 8 or 9 when I had my first real brush with death. It wasn't someone I knew all too well. It was a family friend, someone close to my parents. I never knew why they brought me along to the funeral, but for some reason they did. It didn't take long for me to get bored, since I was a little kid. That led to me wandering off when my parents told me to stay put. The hallways were large and had lots of doorways. I remember opening a few just to peek inside. But they were dark, so I didn't see much of anything. That was probably for the best. Eventually, I came to a room where the lights were already on. There were metal tables around the room. It reminded me of going to the doctor's office, except that room smelled weird too. It wasn't until much later that I realized I wandered into the mortuary. Luckily, there were no bodies in there, or I probably would have ended up traumatized. But something was there, I just didn't know it yet. The lights shut off suddenly, plunging me into darkness. That darkness was already scary enough, since I was just a little kid. But I was in an unfamiliar place, so my imagination decided to run rampant. I worried about monsters and ghosts until a noise brought me out of my thoughts. It sounded like footsteps, like bare feet padding across the smooth floor. They were heavy too, and headed in my direction. With tears in my eyes, I ran to the exit. I gasped and pounded my feet against the floor as I heard the steps behind me pick up their pace. I yanked the door open and slammed it shut behind me. My mother's shouting gave me another scare. "Where have you been? And why are you slamming doors?" I think her look softened when she saw that I was crying. I pointed at the room. "I think something was in there." She quickly grabbed my hand and pulled me away from the door. She grabbed me back to the funeral while I tried to catch my breath. Every now and then, I could hear the faintest footsteps behind us. The rest of the funeral went off without a hitch, but the steps lingered and haunted me long after that. Ever since then, I've been able to hear them, following behind me, never getting too close. They get the loudest and the closest whenever I'm in that same darkness.